Amelia. Story credited to and photo posted by Servant of Necrofear. London, 1873. Sitting by the fireplace within his ill-kept home of the Greychapel district was a man named Marcus Reed. He sat alone on the wooden beams of the dusty floor, ignoring the mess of broken chairs, windows, and the smell of rotten food. He just sat there, the damaged man that he was, rubbing his tears at a chained locket photograph of his lost love, Amelia. Marcus. Oh God, reunite us forever if a merciful deity you are. Do you turn a deaf ear to me, or is the distance much too far? Oh, devil, if my wife you have, a deal I would like to make. In her place, I beg you, my soul should you take. Marcus would sit there for hours every day since Amelia's death, repeating the same 2 prayers over again, fully willing to accept any divine intervention to cure the ache within his heart, whether he was a believer or not. The time came one night when his patience had run its course. Marcus stood, clenching the locket in his fist, as the dying fire lit up not just his ragged clothing, but a sickening ambition behind the eyes of a desperate man. His body, weak and malnourished, stumbled out of the doorway and into the cobblestone road. He found himself alone in the midst of the night. Marcus looked around before traveling down the sidewalk as the gaslights partially lit his way through the thick fog. With only his thoughts for company, Marcus ignored the disgusting stench of urine-scented alleyways mixed with cheap gin and ale. Occasionally, he would pass by the average drunkard sleeping it off against the walls as they breathed on their empty bottles. Even though these unpleasantries didn't slow his progression, however, something else did, far beyond the fog. Thump, thump. Marcus stopped then and lifted his head and glanced around. There was something about that sound, he silently thought to himself. It sounded close, and yet so far away. A moment passes in eerie silence before he begins walking again to his destination. After a couple of minutes, with only the sound of the cobblestones beneath his steps, it was then that mysterious sound came back for another short moment. Thump, thump. Marcus stops under one of the gaslights, then realizes those sounds were slightly louder this time. He looks at his entire surroundings even quicker, but even with the gaslit flames up and down the street, the fog still limits his viewing distance. Unable to find the source of whatever it was, he begins walking again, but slightly faster. Thump, 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 thump. The sounds have become more extensive and louder to the point he's able to make them out as heartbeats. Marcus starts to sense that the beats are somehow beginning to be focused on him. His fear rises as he quickens his pace even more, fearing the possibility that someone is following him, but remains well hidden somewhere inside the fog. This forces Marcus to go from a quick pace to a sluggish jog. The heartbeats are becoming even more constant as they bombard his mind relentlessly. Thump, 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 thump. They nearly overwhelm the poor man until they suddenly cease the moment Marcus arrives in the area he intended to go, or at least very close to it. He finds himself staring at the large wooden doors of St. George's Church. Staring at the imposing structure causes him to experience flashbacks of the multiple times both he and Amelia would stop by to admire the grand architecture, especially the stone statue of St. George holding a sword as if he were about to slay a dragon. Snapping back to reality, Marcus turns around sharply to try and catch a glimpse of his possible pursuer. His eyes scan around as much as possible. However, his efforts were in vain. He breathes a sigh of relief, thinking that he lost his attacker. He walks to his left, then turns right at a corner which was only a few yards away. He continues his way a few moments more, until he arrives finally at the location he was looking for. An iron gate reveals where he is. St. George's Cemetery. At the gate entrance, he tugged on the cold metal in a vain attempt to open it. His pulse slowed as his eyes lifted to the top of the entrance. With his mind and body no longer in the survival fight-or-flight mode, his body returned to its weakened state. However, no matter how ill his body had become, Marcus willed himself to struggle to the top of the gate. His muscles ached, beads of sweat dripped from his hair, and yet still, with teeth grinding, Marcus managed to reach the top of the gate. He sat there, panting heavily, fully determined to complete his ambition. He gazed downward toward the cold black earth, but didn't hesitate to let gravity force his body to fall roughly 20 feet to the ground. He coughed into the dirt a couple of times, still clenching the locket in his left hand. Marcus was about to lose consciousness until Amelia's face appeared within his mind. Marcus dug his right hand into the soil, removing a clump of dirt. Not thinking he was able to stand any more, he crawled his way, inch by inch, further into the graveyard, grunting in pain as he did. It took a long while, but eventually he made it to his true destination, a grave marker. Amelia, born December 25th, 1850, died October 31st, 1873. Marcus sobbed into the ground after reading her grave. His anguish soon turned into anger when the heartbeats returned, but this time stayed with him. He put the chain connected to his locket between his teeth and then began digging up Amelia's grave with his bare hands. His eyes widened more and more the closer he came to Amelia's body. With each new heartbeat, the more animalistic Marcus became. His heavy breathing forced saliva to ooze down the chain of his locket. He then began growling and grunting, becoming more impatient with each passing second. Thump, 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 thump. Silence. It was quiet now. Before he realized, Marcus had finally reached the coffin which housed her lifeless body. He wiped away some of the dirt from atop the wooden box before placing both his hands on the side of the lid. He lifted slowly, hearing the creaking as he did. Now finished, tears filled his eyes once more as he stared down at his beloved. Her skin had become thin and pale with no sign of any color. She was dressed in the same gown she wore on her wedding day, as she wanted, with a crimson sash tied around her waist and a thin, lightly red scarf around her neck that reached as far as her raven-black hair. Unable to say anything, Marcus took Amelia's left hand and placed it to his cheek. The sensation of her cold skin gave him a small sense of comfort that he longed for. After a long moment, he kissed her hand before gently placing it back in beside her body. For the first time since before her death, he smiled, treasuring the moment he had with her. Finally coming to terms with himself, Marcus pulled out a silver knife from behind his back. He stared at it for a moment before pressing the tip of the blade against his flesh, inches away from his heart. For one final look in his eyes, he glanced at Amelia's face. However, he became too stunned to move any part of his body. The chain fell from his teeth the moment he saw Amelia's hazel eyes flash yellow in the moonlight. The next morning, the gravekeeper became furious after discovering that one of the graves had been desecrated. He cursed loudly as he made his way, with shovel in hand, over to rebury the grave. He looked to the marker, expecting to rebury a woman, but was paralyzed with fear to discover the body of Marcus lying alone within Amelia's coffin, with 2 bloody puncture holes in his neck.